Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we step into a world of damp river air, dark soil, and thin morning light, where a plantation wakes before the sun and thousands of private fears stay hidden behind careful faces. What does it feel like to open your eyes in 1730 and know the day is not yours? What happens to ordinary human warmth when every hour is counted for somebody else's profit? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you're here, tell me your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights and let yourself drift into the slow, uneasy hush of early morning Virginia, where mist hangs over the tobacco rows and the first sound you notice is not birdsong but movement, feet on packed earth. A cough in the dark, a door made of rough boards lifting on simple hinges. The plantation is already awake, and so are you. You rise from a pallet that does almost nothing to soften the ground beneath you. The air inside the cabin feels close and stale, touched by old smoke, damp wood, and the faint sourness of clothes worn too many days in a row. Somewhere nearby, a baby fusses. Somewhere else, someone clears their throat and mutters a few quiet words before stepping outside. Morning on an early plantation does not arrive with gentleness. It presses in. In 1730, many black Americans are not yet Americans in any meaningful sense. They are people of African birth, or the children of African parents, living in British colonial territory that sees their bodies as a wealth to be owned, managed, punished, and inherited. The language of the law is cold about it. The reality on the ground is colder still. You're counted in ledgers alongside livestock, tools, barrels, and acreage, which is an impressively rude way to describe a human life. The plantation sits near a river because rivers are roads, storehouses, and escape routes all at once. Tobacco moves out by boat, goods move in, news arrives slowly, often distorted. But the river keeps the plantation tied to a wider Atlantic world. That world is full of merchants, ship captains, insurers, and planters, all making neat profits from disorder and suffering. You do not need to see London or Bristol to feel their reach. It is there in the clothes issued sparingly, the iron tools, the salt in the food, the demands for more crop, more labour, more yield from soil and flesh alike. When you step outside, the dawn feels cool on your skin for a brief, almost luxurious moment. The dirt is cold under bare feet or thin shoes, depending on what has survived the season. The cabin row stands plain and low, built for use rather than comfort. Smoke curls from a few chimneys. Beyond it stretch fields that seem endless when the light is weak. Tobacco plants rule this landscape. They are delicate when young, needy when growing, and tyrannical all season long. You begin to understand one of the great miseries of plantation life. It is not only the hardship itself, it is the ordinary way hardship settles over every part of the day. No trumpet announces injustice, no dramatic music swells. There is only work waiting in the grey morning, and the knowledge that it will go on and on. The people around you move with practiced speed. Some are young, some are already worn down long before old age. Their bodies carry the memory of many dawns like this one. You notice how little wasted motion there is, a cloth tied quickly, a child lifted and soothed, a cooking pot checked, a tool gathered, a look exchanged. The smallest actions matter because time does not belong to you here. On large plantations, tasks may be divided between field hands, domestic servants, artisans, and children old enough to contribute. On smaller places, the lines blur more. Nearly everyone does whatever keeps the enterprise going. Black men, women, and children are pushed into labour systems designed around profit, not fairness. Women work the fields as well as men, even while carrying domestic burdens that colonial records often minimise. Children are put to work early, first in small duties, then in longer, harder labour. Historians still argue over exactly how daily routines differed from one colony to another, because the records were mostly kept by owners, not by the people forced to endure the system. That silence sits heavily over the whole period. Breakfast, if it comes before work, is simple and meagre. Cornmeal, mush. Perhaps leftovers. Perhaps nothing until later. Food is fuel, and not enough of it. You smell ash, damp grain, and a trace of pork if the plantation is provisioning decently by its own stingy standards. Hunger is not always dramatic. Often it is dull, familiar, and constant, like a second heartbeat. There is a strange cruelty in how beautiful the morning can be. The sky lightens in pale bands over the trees. Dew clings to leaves. The river carries a silver shine. Birds call from the brush with no awareness of property law. For a few breaths, the world feels almost tender. Then the commands begin. A name called sharply, a group directed toward the fields, a warning about pace. Beauty remains, but it does not soften power. You walk toward the day's labour under watchful eyes. Surveillance is woven into plantation life from the start. On some estates there is an overseer. On others, the owner himself hovers, or a trusted driver among the enslaved is forced into an impossible position between command and survival. There is no privacy in the meaningful sense. Someone notices who lags, who coughs, who looks tired, who tries to speak too long, who seems to hold too much spirit in reserve. Many black people on plantations in 1730 come from different regions of West and West Central Africa. They may speak different languages, carry different memories, and have different skills with farming, metalwork, weaving, animal care, or healing. That diversity matters. Colonial records flatten African people into a single category. But the people forced together on plantations are anything but identical. One person may know rice cultivation techniques. Another may remember particular songs, proverbs, or rituals. Another may carry herbal knowledge that becomes precious in a place where formal medical care is sparse and often cruel. A quirky detail slips through the archive now and then. Some planters believed certain African groups were better suited for particular crops or climates, as though human beings came with convenient labels for exploitation. The arrogance is breathtaking. It also reveals something important. Enslavers knew Africans brought knowledge. They stole labour, yes, but they also extracted expertise while pretending they had invented the whole order themselves. As the sun rises, the field changes character. Cool dampness gives way to warmth, then heat. Tobacco work is intensely physical. The plants must be tended carefully, weeded, hoed, wormed, topped, cut, hung, sorted. Nothing about this crop is casual. It stains hands. It demands posture that punishes the back. It fills the air with green, bitter smells. You brush against broad leaves slick with moisture, and by midday your skin feels coated with soil, sweat, and the plant's sticky residue. You begin to notice sound as a map of the plantation. The scrape of hoes, the soft thud of feet, insects rising in the grass, a far cry from the house yard, the creak of wagon wheels, chickens fussing near the cabins, dogs barking, the occasional crack of anger in a human voice, sharp enough to tighten every muscle in your body. Sound tells you where power is concentrated and where danger may drift next. For enslaved people newly arrived from Africa, the shock is more than physical displacement. It is social collapse forced at terrifying speed. Kin networks are broken. Familiar landmarks vanish. Religious worlds are interrupted. Food tastes different. Seasons behave strangely. Even the stars may seem wrong. Yet adaptation begins anyway, because human beings are stubbornly alive. You learn voices, paths, habits, and moods. You learn who can be trusted a little, which is not the same as being safe. Some people on the plantation have been there for years. A few may have memories reaching back to a time before slavery hardened completely into hereditary racial law. Earlier in the 17th century, the status of Africans in English colonies could sometimes be fluid. though never fair. By 1730, that ambiguity is narrowed brutally. In colonies like Virginia, slavery is entrenched in law and custom, tied directly to race and passed through the mother. That legal detail shapes lives with chilling efficiency. It turns women's bodies into sites of both labour and inherited bondage. You feel this truth not as a legal concept, but as atmosphere. Every relationship is touched by it. Parents fear for children not only because childhood is hard, but because the future itself has been claimed by someone else. Love exists here, fiercely. So does dread. During a brief pause, a few words pass quietly between workers. The language may be English, broken by accent or reshaped by necessity. It may include African words held close. It may be a blend emerging under pressure, the beginning of new ways of speaking in a harsh new world. Scholars debate how quickly Creole languages formed in different colonies and regions, and the answer likely varied more than any single explanation admits. What is certain is that people made meaning together under conditions designed to isolate them. That, perhaps, is one of the most important things to feel in this hour. Plantation life tries to reduce a person to labour, yet no one is only labour. Someone hums while working. Someone shares a glance that carries humour dry as dust. Someone adjusts a child's wrapping with careful fingers. Someone remembers a rhythm from far across the ocean and taps it softly on a bucket rim when nobody powerful seems to notice. By noon, the heat presses down with authority. Clothes cling to the skin. The smell of crushed plants grows heavier. Sweat stings your eyes. Your shoulders ache. Your hands complain with every grip. The body becomes an inventory of discomfort. Yet even discomfort is not evenly distributed. Pregnant women still work. Older people still work if they can stand. Children carry loads too large for their size. The plantation is not interested in fairness, only output. The main house sits apart, often elevated slightly, as if architecture itself wishes to make a point. Its shade, food, furniture, and space reflect the labour extracted from everyone else. Domestic workers move between worlds, close to the planter family but never inside their circle. They may know private tensions, overhear business concerns, or catch scraps of news from town. That knowledge can be useful. It can also be dangerous. Intimacy with power is not the same as protection. Usually it means more scrutiny, not less. One unsettling feature of early plantation life is how ordinary enslavers often consider themselves. They write letters about crops, weather, debts, and church attendance. They complain about labour shortages and damp-curing barns. They discuss human beings as assets while also fussing over table manners. The contradiction barely troubles them. You would think a conscience might knock louder. Apparently not always. Afternoon stretches. The sun shifts. Time becomes slow and mechanical. You work because stopping invites punishment. You keep pace because being noticed can be worse than being tired. Yet within that tight frame, tiny choices remain. A whispered warning, a shared sip of water, a fragment of song, a slower motion when watchfulness drifts elsewhere. Nothing romantic, nothing cinematic. Just small acts by people refusing to vanish inside the role forced upon them. There are also moments of uncertainty that historians cannot fully resolve. How much freedom of movement did enslaved people on a given plantation have after dark? How often could they visit spouses or kin on neighbouring estates? How much African religious practice survived in open form, and how much retreated into disguised custom? The answers shift by place, owner, labour force, and decade. The archive leaves many edges blurred. The people themselves knew the reality in detail. Posterity gets fragments. At last the light softens, the field exhales a little. Evening brings relief to the skin, though not always to the spirit. Tools are gathered, rows are left behind. Feet turn back toward cabins and yards and cooking fires. Smoke rises again, this time with the smell of supper if supplies allow it. corn, beans, a little meat, perhaps greens from a small garden plot if one exists. Some plantations permit provision grounds where enslaved people grow food for themselves on marginal land and stolen scraps of time. The arrangement is often presented by owners as generosity. It is closer to offloading the cost of feeding the workforce. You return carrying the day in your muscles. The cabin looks no grander than it did at dawn, but now it offers something the field did not: a sliver of shelter, a place where voices can lower, where hands can mend, where memory can breathe a little. Night on the plantation is not freedom, yet it allows a different texture of life to emerge: stories, prayer, planning, grief, tenderness, and exhaustion all gather in the dark. The sky deepens overhead. Crickets begin. Smoke catches in your throat. Nearby, someone starts a melody so soft it almost disappears into the evening air. Still, it is there. That matters. In a world built to command your body, the quiet persistence of inner life becomes its own kind of truth. You lie down knowing dawn will come too soon. The ground remains hard. The future remains uncertain. But within the long, bruising day, human feeling has not been erased. It survives in breath, in touch, in guarded speech, in the stubborn fact that you are still a person, even here. You step out into a plantation world that seems arranged by someone who wanted distance to feel natural. Nothing is random here. The fields spread wide for profit. The house rises where it can be seen. The outbuildings sit where work can be measured. Even the paths in the dirt tell you who may walk freely and who must move with purpose. A place can speak without words, and this one says, control in every direction. In 1730, an early plantation is less a single home than a working landscape. It is a machine built out of wood, mud, water, iron, and human bodies. You feel that the moment you begin to move through it. The main house stands apart, often on slightly better ground, where breezes are cooler and puddles drain faster. A kitchen may sit nearby, sometimes separate to reduce the risk of fire. Smokehouses, dairies, sheds, curing barns, storehouses, stables, pens, and workshops gather around it in practical clusters. Everything has a function. Everything exists to keep production going. You notice how sightlines matter. From the house yard, a planter or overseer can look toward roads, cabins, and work areas with unnerving ease. Open space is useful for wagons and livestock, of course, but it is also useful for watching people. Trees are cut back where a thicker grove might offer cover. Paths are beaten firm by repeated footsteps, and those paths become habits, then rules, then silent expectations. You do not need a signpost to know where you should not linger. The quarters for enslaved people stand away from the planter family, close enough for supervision but far enough to mark rank. These cabins are usually small, rough, and crowded, built from logs, earth-fast posts, clapboards, or whatever material the owner can spare without feeling too charitable. The walls may lean slightly, gaps may let in wind, floors might be hard-packed dirt, glass windows are rare luxuries. More often there are shutters, small openings, or no proper openings at all beyond a door that fits as badly as the rest. The cabins are not only housing, they're also kitchens, nurseries, sick rooms, workspaces, and places of mourning. You can smell several lives pressed together in one room. Wood smoke hangs in cloth and hair, damp straw carries a sweet, stale smell. Cornmeal dust lingers in corners, if rain has come recently. Wet earth breathes up through the floor. In winter the place can be draughty and mean. In summer it can feel thick as a covered pot. Some plantations arrange the cabins in a row. Others place them in a loose cluster. Historians debate how much these patterns reflected simple convenience and how much they were deliberate tools of oversight. The answer was likely both. A tidy line makes counting easier. A tight cluster allows quick communication among enslaved people, which owners often feared. A scattered arrangement can reduce private gathering, though it also makes labour coordination less efficient. Plantation design was never perfectly fixed, but it almost always leaned toward visibility. You walk farther, and the geography sharpens your understanding of power. The big house is set where air feels lighter. The quarters sit where mud collects. The owner's family eats from tables hauled with imported goods. Enslaved families stretch meals beside little fires with broken pots and tired hands. The contrast is not accidental. Hierarchy is built into the ground itself. A well or water source becomes one of the plantation's quiet centres. People must come to it. Buckets knock against stone or wood. Rope rubs and squeaks. Water smells cool and mineral-rich, with a touch of moss from the shaded rim. Women and children often bear much of this carrying labour, though everyone depends on the result. Even here, the route matters. How far is the walk who stands nearby, who can speak freely for a minute, and who must keep eyes lowered because someone important is near? A few yards can decide whether an exchange feels human or dangerous. The plantation road runs like a vein through the property. Wagons use it. Horses use it. Visitors use it. News, goods, and trouble all arrive along it. You hear wheels grinding over ruts, hooves pressing wet clay, and the occasional crack of a whip over animals rather than people, though the distinction offers limited comfort. Dust hangs on dry days. In rainy weather, boots sink and curse-worthy mud clings to everything. The road connects the plantation to market towns, docks, courthouses, and churches. It also reminds you that this place is not isolated from the colony. It is part of the colony's economic heart, near the crop fields. Specialised buildings reveal the plantation's purpose. In tobacco regions, curing barns matter enormously. Their smell is unforgettable. Green sweetness dries into something darker, sharper, and almost medicinal. Leaves hang in rows, turning colour as air and time do their work. The barns feel shadowed and close. Dust may catch in your throat. Every beam and tier pole exists because someone expects the harvest to move from soil to barrel to ship with as little loss as possible. If the plantation is in a rice region farther south, the layout changes around water control, embankments, trunks, ditches, and tidal flow. If it grows indigo, vats and processing areas take on grim importance. The crop shapes the land, and the land shapes the day. That is one mainstream truth of colonial plantation life. These places were not generic farms. They were highly organised labour regimes built around export agriculture, and their physical arrangement reflected that purpose with cold precision. Workshops sit at another edge of the world. A blacksmith's area carries the smell of hot metal, ash, and singed hoof. A cooper's shed rings with hammer taps on staves and hoops. A carpenter's bench gives off the clean scent of fresh cut wood, which is one of the few pleasant smells available without emotional penalties attached. Some enslaved men work in these skilled trades. Their labour is valuable, and sometimes their knowledge gives them slightly more mobility across the property. Slightly more is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Skill does not cancel bondage. You might notice small kitchen gardens near the quarters if the owner allows them. These plots can hold beans, greens, peas, gourds, or medicinal herbs. Their existence may look like kindness in a planter's diary. It is usually thrift disguised as benevolence. If enslaved people can grow some of their own food, the owner spends less. Still, these patches matter. The smell of crushed onion greens or herb leaves under your fingers brings a rare hint of self-directed care into an economy designed to deny it. Chickens scratch near the cabins. Pigs root at the edge of refuse heaps. A few dogs weave around the yards with the self-importance dogs have always enjoyed. Livestock adds constant sound to the plantation. Grunts, bleats, clucks, and barking mingle with human voices, making the place feel busy even during pauses in field work. Animal life also marks status. Horses suggest command and travel. Oxen suggest hauling power. A thin hen near a cabin suggests an uncertain meal, and a possible argument about whose bird it really is. A quirky little detail from the period slips through estate records now and then. Some planters planted decorative trees or kept small formal gardens near the main house to display refinement, as though symmetry and rose cuttings could distract from the fact that the whole enterprise rested on coerced labour. Colonial gentility had quite a talent for powdered elegance sitting beside moral collapse. The gravel path might be neat, the system remained rotten. You begin to see how movement is managed by thresholds. Doors matter, gates matter, fences matter. Not every barrier is high, but many are symbolic. A fence around the house yard separates more than chickens from vegetables. It marks social distance. The doorway to a storeroom marks access to food, cloth, and tools. A locked chest marks trust withheld. The path to the river landing marks connection to a market world from which enslaved people are largely excluded except as cargo handlers and forced labourers. The river landing or dock area has its own atmosphere: tar, wet wood, fish smell, rope fibres, and mud blend into a heavy scent that clings to your clothes. Boats knock gently against poles, crates shift, barrels roll with a hollow thunder. At certain seasons the landing becomes frantic because crops must move and invoices must be met. This edge of the plantation feels outward-looking, but it does not offer freedom. It offers commerce. That is a different thing entirely. Church, if it enters plantation life at all, may be off the property or loosely imposed upon it. Some owners care about religious instruction because they think it encourages obedience. Others worry that baptism might confuse legal status, a concern more common in earlier generations but not entirely gone. Historians still dispute how deeply Christian teaching reached enslaved communities by 1730 in different colonies, partly because formal records capture owners' intentions more clearly than enslaved people's private beliefs. What is clear is that religious space was uneven, negotiated, and often limited. Children experience this geography differently from adults. To a child, the plantation can feel huge in some moments and claustrophobic in others. A fence may look like a horizon. A barn loft may feel mysterious. A path between cabins may become a place for quick games, tiny errands, or whispered jokes. Yet children also learn the map of danger early. They know where dogs are tied, which adults are quick-tempered, where tools must never be touched, and how near they may drift before a sharp voice calls them back. Childhood does not disappear, but it is narrowed. At midday, the smell of food from the main house kitchen can drift outward in maddening waves. Roasting meat, fresh bread, butter, herbs, onions in hot fat. The scent floats across space that feels suddenly measurable in cruelty. In the quarters, meals are plainer and often insufficient. Geography turns hunger into a lesson. You can smell abundance you are not meant to share. That kind of knowledge settles in the body. The plantation also has hidden geographies, known better by the enslaved than by those who claim to own the land. There are shaded places where a person can pause for one private breath. There are routes between buildings that avoid certain eyes. There are patches of woods where children gather kindling and adults exchange quick words. There may be a tree that offers a useful landmark for meetings, a ditch that hides a small object, or a bend in the path where one can see danger coming a second sooner. Official maps never show such things. Lived maps do. Night changes the landscape again. Distances grow uncertain. Buildings flatten into shadow. Sounds carry farther. A murmured conversation outside a cabin may travel across still air. Footsteps on dry leaves become loud enough to matter. Moonlight can silver the road and make every pale trunk look like a watcher. For some, darkness offers a little privacy. For others, it sharpens fear of patrols, punishment, or sudden summons. Space never stops being political simply because the sun has gone down. You also notice how the plantation is tied to exhaustion by design. Cabins are placed so people can be sent to fields quickly. Work buildings sit close to the crop cycle. The owner's view is preserved where practical. Storage is centralized. Labor is dispersed. The arrangement saves time for management while costing time and energy to everyone below. Even architecture participates in extraction. One of the saddest truths of the place is that people must build lives inside it anyway. A mother wipes a child's face at a cabin door. A man repairs a stool with careful hands. Someone hangs herbs to dry. Someone smooths a blanket. Someone scratches a pattern into soft dirt with a stick while thinking. Human beings keep making shelter even where shelter is denied. You feel it in the way a corner can be tidied, a fire tended, a little object hidden and treasured. The plantation may be designed for labour, but the people within it keep insisting on being more than labour units. By the time you finish walking its roads, yards, edges, and workspaces, the place feels less like a farm and more like an argument made in timber and clay. It argues that some lives deserve comfort and oversight, while others deserve fatigue and surveillance. It argues that wealth should sit uphill and hardship downhill. It argues that efficiency matters more than kinship. Yet every human trace in the quarters offers a reply, not a loud one, not always a safe one, still a reply. A cooking pot seasoned by many hands, a path worn by repeated visits, a garden row kept straight, a song heard through a door at dusk. The geography tries to command the soul, it never quite succeeds. By the time the sky begins to pale, the workday is already leaning over you like a threat. There is no gentle easing into morning here. The plantation wants motion at once. You feel it in the hurry of hands reaching for tools, in the quick swallow of whatever food is available, and in the practiced silence of people saving breath for labour. The day ahead is not mysterious. It will ask for everything your body can give, then complain that you have held something back. In 1730, plantation work is organised around crops that reward relentless attention. Tobacco demands one kind of discipline, rice demands another, indigo, corn, and livestock each pull labour in different directions. Yet the central fact remains the same. Black men, women, and children are expected to work from first light until dark, with little regard for comfort, illness, or simple human limits. The rhythm is so constant that time itself begins to feel owned. You walk to the fields while the air is still cool enough to trick you into hope. Dew wets your ankles. The smell of damp soil rises sharply with each step, rich and earthy, almost pleasant until you remember what it means. The rows lie ahead in long lines that seem to narrow and multiply at once. The land looks calm from a distance. Up close, it is all demand. Weeds, insects, mud, tools, orders, repetition. The first hours of labour often bring hoeing. It is a motion that sounds plain until you do it for long enough. Lift, strike, pull, step, lift, strike, pull. The rhythm settles into your shoulders and lower back, where it begins its slow campaign of complaint. Hands grow slick on the handle, palms toughen over time, but toughness is not immunity. Splinters still happen, blisters still rise. A tool can feel like an extension of your arm until suddenly it feels like a punishment invented by wood itself. The field fills with sound. Hoes chop through dirt and roots. Someone coughs. Someone mutters under breath. Insects buzz low over the crops. The overseer's horse shifts and snorts near the lane. Birds call from the tree line with an almost insulting cheerfulness. A large work group can produce its own rough music, not by intention, but by sheer synchronized effort. The scrape, thud, and rustle become the sound of the plantation earning money. Tobacco work is especially unforgiving because the plant is needy at every stage. Seed beds must be watched. Young plants must be transplanted with care. Weeds must be cleared. Worms must be picked off. Tops must be removed at the right time so the plant grows broad and strong. Leaves must later be cut, carried, hung, cured, sorted, and packed. It is a crop that treats a human body like disposable machinery. The planters adore it for that very reason, though they would not phrase it so honestly. You bend close to the plants and the smell reaches you at once. Green, bitter, sticky, and slightly sour in the heat. Leaves brush your forearms and leave moisture behind. Fine dirt clings to your skin. When the sun climbs higher, the warm scent of crushed vegetation turns heavier, almost thick enough to taste. By midday, your clothes carry the field with them. You smell like earth and tobacco and sweat. There is no escaping it. Some plantations organize labour in gangs, with groups kept working under direct watch at a fixed pace. Others use task systems more often, especially in some rice regions, where a defined amount of work may be assigned before limited personal time begins. Historians disagree over how rigid these categories remained across time and place, because planters borrowed methods and adapted them unevenly. What is beyond dispute is that neither system was humane. One measured the body by the hour, the other measured it by the burden. Both assumed that every waking minute should be squeezed. In a tobacco field, pace matters constantly. If one person slows, the difference is visible. If someone stops too long to straighten an aching back, notice comes quickly. The eyes on the field are rarely still. An overseer may ride along the edge, boots in stirrups, hat broad against the sun, carrying the easy posture of a man whose fatigue is mostly theoretical. A driver may relay commands with a strained face, trapped in that cruel space where survival can require enforcing the misery of others. Power enjoys layers. It makes the whole arrangement more efficient and more bitter. Women work beside men in many of these fields, their labour essential and expected. Colonial records often write as if male effort built plantation wealth, while female effort simply drifted in support. The ground tells a different story. Women hoe, plant, weed, carry, process, and endure the same punishing weather. Some do so while pregnant, some do so after tending children at dawn, or before tending them at night. The body is asked to split itself into pieces. Somehow, it keeps moving. Children begin with smaller jobs, though smaller does not mean light. They fetch water, gather wood, scare birds from crops, carry messages, mind younger children, and learn to handle tools before many would now consider them old enough to do much more than chase chickens. As they grow, the work grows with them. A child learns the plantation through labour first, curiosity second. That is one of the bleakest features of the system. It trains obedience before it allows wonder. Rice work in the lower south brings different textures of suffering. There the fields can be wet, insect-heavy, and dangerous in ways the plantation journals often understate. Mud grips your ankles. Water flashes hard under sunlight. Mosquitoes whine around ears and necks. The air feels swollen and still. Knowledge brought from West Africa shaped rice cultivation profoundly, though planters wrote as though land and profit simply arranged themselves. A quirky fact from the period is that some enslavers specifically sought captives from rice-growing regions of Africa, hoping to extract agricultural expertise while denying the humanity attached to it. Exploitation likes to pretend it discovered what it actually stole. Across crop types, the day is structured by repetition. Repetition wears on the mind as surely as it wears on the body. You complete one row only to face another. You fill one basket only to lift the next. You strip leaves, tie bundles, drag branches, clear brush, or haul barrels in sequences that could numb thought altogether if people did not resist that numbness in small ways. A person hums under breath. Someone marks pace with a phrase too quiet to count as speech. Someone turns a complaint into dry humour that makes another worker hide a tired smile. That humour matters. It is not cheerfulness. It is a stubborn refusal to let the plantation define every emotion available. A shared glance can say more than a long speech. So can a muttered line with a little bite in it. Human wit survives in hard places because it is light to carry and difficult to confiscate. By late morning, the sun begins to press. Shoulders burn, The back of your neck grows hot. Sweat runs down your spine and catches at the waistband of your clothing. Linen or rough wool sticks where it should breathe. A hat, if you have one, shades only part of the trouble. Water is precious and often warm by the time it reaches the field. A sip cools the mouth for a moment, then disappears into thirst. The body keeps asking for more than the day intends to provide. Work does not pause simply because conditions grow miserable. That would suggest the human frame deserves consultation. Plantations rarely grant that principle. If a storm threatens, labour may accelerate, crops must be secured, leaves must be moved, fences must be checked, animals must be brought in. The sky can darken beautifully. Clouds gathering in bruised layers while wind moves through the crop rows with a whispering sound. Even then, beauty serves as backdrop rather than relief. There are specialists on some plantations, and their days unfold differently. Carpenters repair structures, blacksmiths mend ironwork, coopers shape barrels for storage and transport, boatmen, mill workers, ditchers, and teamsters all carry distinct burdens. Skilled labour can bring a degree of status within the enslaved community, and sometimes a few practical advantages, such as movement across the property or access to useful information. Yet skilled hands remain owned hands. Expertise does not protect a person from punishment, sale, or grief. Processing work can be as taxing as field labour. Tobacco leaves must be handled with care, especially when cutting and curing time arrives. You carry armfuls that scratch and drag against the body. In the barn, the air turns dim and dusty. Leaves hang overhead in ordered lines and the smell deepens into something heavy, sweet, and almost fermented. Sorting demands attention. Packing requires force. Barrels do not fill themselves, unfortunately for everyone except the man calculating profits from a desk. Meals in the middle of the day, where they exist, are brief and plain. Cornmeal, perhaps a little salted meat, maybe beans or peas. The food sits in the stomach like a promise that has not quite been kept. You eat quickly because the pause is short. You may sit on a stump, crouch in a patch of shade, or remain standing with the bowl in your hands. A breeze, if it comes, feels like private mercy. Then the work resumes before the body has fully believed in rest. Historians still argue over the exact pace and seasonal variation of daily labour, because plantation records often describe ideal output rather than actual practice. Owners had reasons to exaggerate control, just as later observers sometimes repeated those claims too neatly. Rain, illness, resistance, tool breakage, and sheer human exhaustion all disrupted the schedule. The system wanted perfect extraction. Reality kept interfering, often through the simple fact that people are not engines. That interference could take quiet forms. A hoe handle loosens at a convenient moment. A load is tied less efficiently than it might have been. A worker slows just enough to matter, though not enough to invite immediate violence. None of this guarantees safety. None of it overturns the system. Still, it shows that labour on a plantation is never as total as the owner imagines. Coercion can command effort, but it cannot produce full surrender of the inner self. As afternoon lengthens, fatigue changes character. In the morning, pain feels fresh and specific. By later hours it becomes broad and dull, like a heavy cloth laid over the whole body. Knees stiffen, hands throb quietly. The lower back feels carved from wood. Dust settles in the nose and throat. Even the eyes seem tired, as though seeing itself has become work. You keep moving because stopping would make starting again even harder. There is also the emotional labour of caution. You measure tone before speaking. You judge distance before turning your head. You keep track of where authority stands in the field. The mind is always counting. Is the overseer watching? Is someone angry today? Has a horse been brought out because pace is expected to increase? Are the clouds making everyone tense? This kind of alertness drains a person almost as much as lifting and carrying. Fear is exhausting, so is restraint. The workday shapes the seasons, too. Planting time brings urgency. Weeding stretches into long weeks of monotony. Harvest brings intense bursts of labour that can run every usable hour. Winter does not necessarily mean idleness. There is wood to cut, fences to mend, tools to repair, buildings to patch, animals to tend, and materials to prepare for another year of extraction. Plantation life follows an agricultural calendar, but the calendar is interpreted by greed. Late in the day, the light begins to soften and the field looks briefly forgiving. Rows turn gold at the edges. Dust hangs in the air like fine smoke. Insects shift their song. Mussels, however, do not care about lovely light. They care that you have been bent, lifting, gripping, and walking since dawn. The body counts truth better than scenery does. When the order finally comes to gather tools and leave the field, relief moves through you fast but quietly. Nobody wastes energy celebrating too early. Hoes are carried back. Bundles are stacked. Wagons creak toward barns or sheds. Feet turn toward the quarters with the dragging steadiness of people who know evening brings more duties. Water must still be carried. Fires must still be built. Clothes must be mended. Children must be fed. Rest, like so much else, arrives only in fragments. Yet the end of work in the field changes the air around you. Conversation can breathe a little. Shoulders loosen, if only by degrees. The smell of smoke from cooking fires begins to replace the smell of crushed crop. Your hands are sore, your stomach impatient, your clothes rough with sweat and dirt. But the hardest watched hours are passing. That matters. You walk back with the day lodged deep in your muscles. This is what first light to dark means on an early plantation. Not merely long hours, but an entire order of life built around extracting motion, strength, and attention from the same bodies again and again. The labour is agricultural. Yes, it is also theatrical in its own grim way. Every day, power stages the same performance of command and endurance under the open sky. And every day, the people in the rows bring to it their fatigue, their skill, their restraint, their private thoughts, and the stubborn pulse of personhood that no amount of work can fully thresh out of them. When the field finally releases you, the plantation does not suddenly become kind. It simply changes its demands. You return to the quarters carrying dirt in the creases of your hands, ache in your shoulders, and hunger that now feels sharp enough to have edges. Evening settles over the cabins in wood smoke and dim gold light. For a few moments the place looks almost peaceful, which is a sly trick of sunset. The walls are still rough, the air is still heavy, the food is still too little, yet this is where life gathers itself again. The cabin stands low and plain, built to keep people alive, not comfortable. You duck through the doorway and the smell meets you at once. Smoke from old fires, damp timber, straw, sweat dried into cloth, a little cornmeal dust, perhaps a faint trace of herbs hung to dry. If someone has managed to save any, the air carries all the evidence of a cramped life. It is not pleasant, exactly, but it is known. Familiarity becomes its own kind of shelter. Most plantation cabins in 1730 are crude by design. Owners spend money where profit expands, not where dignity might. Some cabins are made of logs notched together with clay packed into gaps. Others use rough planks or posts set directly into the earth. Roofs may be shingles, boards, or thatch depending on region and resources. Rain finds weaknesses. Wind finds them too. In winter, the cold creeps through cracks as if invited. In summer, heat hangs inside the room long after sunset. Thick and close on the skin. Furniture is sparse. A few stools, maybe a bench. Perhaps a rough table if someone has managed to build or repair one. Sleeping places may be simple wooden frames, but often they are pallets on the floor stuffed with straw, leaves, or whatever material can be gathered. Blankets are precious. Cloth is precious. Nearly everything soft is precious because softness is rare here. Your hand runs over wood, polished not by craftsmanship but by years of use. The surface feels uneven, splintered in places, smooth in others where many fingers have passed. Crowding shapes every movement, bodies share space with tools, cooking pots, bundles of clothing, scraps of food, and small treasured objects that would mean nothing to an overseer, but everything to the people who keep them. A child sleeps in the corner. Someone mends a shirt near the fire. Someone else leans against the wall with eyes half closed, too tired even to speak. Privacy is not a room with a door. Privacy is a lowered voice, a turned shoulder. A brief moment when others look elsewhere. The clothing you wear reflects the same economy of neglect. Plantation owners usually issue coarse garments made from cheap cloth such as linen, hemp, wool mixtures, or osnaburg. The fabric scratches, seams split, sleeves fray, shoes, if distributed at all, may be stiff, badly fitted, and save for colder weather or more public tasks. Many go barefoot for long stretches of the year. The ground teaches itself to the soles of your feet, every pebble and thorn included. There is an intimacy to worn clothing that records hardship better than any ledger. A shirt darkened with sweat at the collar, knees gone shiny with use, cuffs ragged from work, patches sewn over older patches until the original shape of the garment becomes a kind of rumour. Women often remake, alter, and repair garments constantly, not because they have leisure for neat domestic craft, but because survival demands that fabric last beyond reason. Thread matters. Needles matter. A scrap of cloth can feel almost luxurious, which is a sentence that tells you all you need to know. You sit near the fire and begin the evening labour of mending. The thread catches in your dry fingertips. The cloth feels stiff with dirt and salt. Firelight flickers over hands moving with practiced economy. A torn shift becomes wearable again. A child's hem is let down. A hole near the shoulder is closed with stitches that will hold for a while, and then surrender, because everything here holds only for a while. Even repair has to be repaired. Food comes next, or the attempt at it. Hunger governs the cabin as surely as any overseer governs the field. Plantation rations are often based on cornmeal, perhaps with salted pork, herring, or other cheap provisions depending on region. Sometimes there are beans, peas, or molasses, sometimes less than that. A ration may keep a body moving but not well fed. There is a difference between not starving outright and being nourished. The plantation is generally interested only in the first. Cornmeal forms the backbone of many meals. It becomes mush, porridge, ash cake, hoe cake, or a rough bread baked near coals. The smell is plain and comforting in a modest way, warm and grainy, with a hint of smoke. If a little fat can be added, the taste improves at once. If not, the food still goes down because hunger is persuasive. A pot may bubble with beans or greens if someone has managed to grow or gather them. Salted meat, when available, adds savour but not abundance. The salt bites the tongue. The meat can be tough enough to make your jaw feel employed. A quirky detail from plantation records and travellers' accounts is that some owners congratulated themselves on generosity for issuing weekly food allowances that were barely adequate, then acted baffled when enslaved people hunted, fished, trapped, or kept gardens to survive. The same men might praise their own paternal care while counting every barrel of corn with a face like a saint of arithmetic. Colonial self-admiration was a sturdy weed. Small garden plots can make a sharp difference. Near some cabins, you may find collards, beans, peas, squash, sweet potatoes, onions, or herbs coaxed from narrow strips of earth after dark or on precious scraps of time. The soil under your fingernails from such work feels different from field dirt. It belongs, in a limited way, to effort directed toward your own table. A few greens cut at dusk, a handful of peas, a cluster of onions. These can change a meal from mere endurance to something resembling care. The smell of torn herb leaves, fresh and bright in the hand, feels almost defiant. Fishing, trapping, and gathering supplement the diet where geography allows. Rivers offer fish, woods may hold rabbits, turtles, berries, nuts, mushrooms, and wild greens if access is possible. Some of this happens openly, some quietly. Depending on the owner's rules and the season, historians still argue over how much independent food production enslaved people consistently achieved on early plantations, because evidence varies by region and by the temperament of those who kept the records. But the pattern is plain enough. Whenever people could add to their provisions, they tried. Hunger teaches ingenuity very quickly. Children feel hunger with a directness that adults sometimes hide behind routine. You see it in how they watch the pot, in how quickly a bowl is cleaned, in how carefully crumbs are saved. Yet children also find room for quick play even in cramped quarters. A string becomes a toy, a carved scrap of wood becomes a figure. A game unfolds in whispers and finger taps along the floorboards. Childhood persists in fragments, squeezed into the corners left open by labour and want. Mothers and older girls often carry the burden of stretching food into possibility. They stir, divide, save, season, soothe, and judge who needs the larger portion tonight. Their work demands arithmetic without numbers. How much meal remains? Will the pork last? Can the beans be thinned with more water without becoming insultingly thin? Who worked hardest today? Who is ill? Who is growing? Such decisions are not sentimental. They are practical and full of quiet sacrifice. Illness moves through these cabins easily. Close quarters help it along. So do poor diet, damp bedding, hard labour, and inadequate clothing. A cough can linger for weeks. Fever can rise quickly. Small injuries become large problems when rest is impossible. The cabin at night may hold the sound of someone breathing too fast, a child whimpering in sleep, or the low murmur of a person using herbal knowledge handed across generations. Mint, sassafras, willow, pine resin, garlic, roots, barks, poultices, teas, African healing knowledge, native knowledge, and colonial remedies often mixed in practical ways. People used what they had. They had to. Scholars continue to debate how much specific African foodways remained intact on early British plantations in 1730, especially in regions where people from many cultures were forced together and supplies were tightly controlled. Yet certain habits of preparation, seasoning, cultivation, and communal eating clearly survived and adapted. Food carries memory with stubborn force. A pot can preserve an ancestry more quietly than a document. The fire itself becomes a centre of feeling. Its warmth touches the shins while your back stays cool. Smoke drifts upward and sometimes sideways if the chimney pulls poorly, making eyes sting and throats scratch. Sparks jump. Ash settles on the hearth. The glow softens faces and turns the cabin walls amber. It is one of the few things here that gives more than it takes, though even fire demands tending and fuel. A person who knows how to bank coals overnight is worth admiring. Morning is always easier when flame survives the dark. You look more closely at the interior and notice objects that carry whole private worlds. A gourd cup polished by use, a spoon carved smooth at the handle, a rag doll stuffed with scraps, a charm hidden in a fold of cloth, beads, a shell, a button saved for no clear reason except that once it belonged to someone loved. Material life on a plantation is meagre, but meaning accumulates around small things. When possessions are few, each item must work harder, and often it does. The body, meanwhile, asks for relief in several languages at once. Feet throb. The shoulders pinch. Hands ache when opening and closing. The skin under coarse cloth feels rubbed raw in places. If you wash, it may be with cool water from a basin or bucket, enough to lift some dirt and not enough to banish the day. The touch of water on sore hands can feel glorious for 3 seconds and then merely cold. Even comfort arrives modestly. Women's clothing needs draw special effort: shifts, petticoats, wraps, aprons, kerchiefs, and stockings wear hard under plantation conditions. Men's shirts and trousers suffer no less. Children inherit altered garments whenever possible. Cloth moves from adult to child, from shirt to rag, from rag to patch, from patch to almost nothing. Textile scarcity shapes social life in subtle ways. A person with a cleaner kerchief or better mended shirt may have spent precious night hours making it so. Appearance can reflect skill and discipline, not abundance. There is also humiliation built into dress. Owners may issue clothing in bulk, by season, with little regard for fit. A garment hangs badly, pinches, slips, or exposes more than it should. The message is clear enough. Comfort is irrelevant. Modesty is optional unless the owner suddenly decides to perform morality. Still, people alter what they can. A fold is pinned, a sleeve is shortened, a head wrap is tied with care. Style survives, even when materials barely deserve the word. Some nights the cabin fills with conversation, some nights silence wins. Exhaustion decides the matter more often than mood. When people do talk, the talk moves between practical concerns and deeper currents. Who is sick? Who needs help with mending? Which ration is running low? Whether fish were seen in the creek? Whether a child's cough is better? Whether someone knows a route for swelling? Domestic life on a plantation is not separate from oppression. It unfolds inside it, under it, and despite it. The smell of supper lingers after bowls are emptied. Smoke, corn, a trace of salt, maybe greens cooked down to softness. It is not a grand feast. It is enough to make the cabin briefly feel settled. Hands rest. Breathing slows. Someone leans against another's shoulder. A child falls asleep before the last embers fade much. The room is cramped, but closeness can also be its own defence against despair. Warmth shared among bodies is still warmth. One mainstream truth of early plantation life is that owners regularly underprovided housing, clothing, and food while expecting maximum labour output. The contradiction was not hidden, it was fundamental. Another truth sits beside it. Enslaved people responded with skill, adaptation, and domestic labour that kept families and communities alive under impossible conditions. The cabin is not merely a scene of deprivation. It is also a workshop of endurance. You lower yourself onto bedding that barely softens the floor. Straw shifts underneath with a dry whisper. The blanket feels rough against tired skin. Smoke still hangs in the room. Through gaps in the wall or shutters you hear night insects outside, perhaps a dog barking in the distance, perhaps quiet voices near another doorway. The cabin is dark now except for a small orange eye of coal. Your stomach is not fully satisfied. Your clothes are mended but still coarse. Your body is clean only in patches. None of this would impress a person with standards. Yet standards are a luxury item here. Sleep comes not because the world has grown easy, but because the body can no longer argue. Hunger settles into a lower hum. The room cools slightly. Someone nearby turns over in sleep. Someone else snores softly. Around you are the material facts of plantation life in 1730 crude walls, patched cloth, stretched food, human closeness, hard choices, and 1,000 acts of maintenance hidden from the records of powerful men. In the cabin, survival is made by hand each evening, stitch by stitch, spoonful by spoonful, ember by ember. Night gives people a little cover, and in that cover you begin to notice something the plantation never fully manages to crush. A person may be counted in an inventory, called by a name chosen by an owner, and driven through the day like a tool with legs, yet still carry an inner world that refuses easy capture. In 1731, one of the deepest struggles for black people on early plantations is not only to survive, but to remain themselves while everything around them is arranged to make them forget. Names are part of that struggle from the start. On many plantations, enslaved Africans and their children are given English names by owners, overseers, ministers, or clerks who record them in ledgers and wills. The names can sound ordinary to colonial ears: John, Mary, Tom, Bess, Jack, Dinah. The plainness is part of the violence. A new name makes ownership easier, paperwork tidier, and human complexity less inconvenient. It also tries to flatten a life into something pronounceable by power, yet names are rarely so simple in lived experience. A person may carry one name in the ledger and another among loved ones. A child may be called by a nickname at the cabin door, by a different name in the field, and by a kin term that means far more than either. Sound matters, memory matters. The old self does not vanish just because a planter writes over it with ink. Many African names disappeared from the archive, but disappearance from records is not the same as disappearance from life. You hear this in the way people speak to each other when no authority is close enough to interrupt. A mother uses tenderness absent from the owner's vocabulary. A grandmother calls a child by a soft, private form known only within the family circle. A friend shortens a name into something playful. In those small acts, naming becomes a kind of shelter. It says, "You are more than the label tied to your labour." Kinship works the same way. Plantation slavery is designed to break family ties whenever profit requires it, yet family keeps reforming with remarkable determination. Some families are biological, shaped by parent and child, sibling and cousin, husband and wife. Others are chosen, created by people forced together who become aunties, uncles, elders, protectors, and watchers of children. The plantation may insist on ownership. The people inside it insist on relation. Marriage in this world is fragile because the law does not protect it for the enslaved. A husband and wife may live on the same plantation, or on neighbouring properties, or be separated by sale at any time. That uncertainty shapes affection itself. Love cannot relax into legal promise. It must survive by habit, by visits when possible, by messages carried carefully, by memory, and by the stubborn decision to remain attached even when the system offers every reason to despair. You sense the tenderness in a woman smoothing a man's collar before dawn, in the way two people sit close by the fire after exhausting work, or in the quiet grief of those who must love across distance measured by permission rather than miles. Children stand at the centre of many hopes and fears. A parent teaches a child practical things first, because practical knowledge keeps small bodies alive. Stay away from that horse. Do not touch that iron pot. Keep clear when that man is angry. Carry the water with both hands, but other lessons come too. Ways of speaking, bits of song, a proverb half remembered, a method of tying cloth, a warning about whom to trust, a prayer, a story. The plantation wants children trained for labour. Parents and elders try to make room for something larger, a moral and emotional inheritance that can survive even in cramped conditions. You watch an elder tell a story in the dim light, not loudly, not as a formal ceremony, just with a low, steady voice that gathers listeners close. Storytelling becomes a vessel for memory, humour, instruction, and coded feeling. A boastful animal outwitted by a smaller creature. A warning disguised as a folk tale. A laugh tucked inside a lesson. Scholars have long connected some of these traditions to West and Central African storytelling forms, though tracing exact lines can be difficult. Historians still argue over which specific motifs crossed the Atlantic intact and which were remade in the colonies under shared pressure. The uncertainty is real. So is the continuity. The body itself carries memory too. Hair care, for instance, is not trivial. It is labour, identity, and intimacy all at once. After long days, someone parts another person's hair with careful fingers, braids it, twists it, wraps it, smooths it with whatever oil or fat is available. The touch is gentle, repetitive, and unhurried in a world that allows very little unhurried time. Hairstyles may change under colonial constraints, but the act of grooming one another remains powerful. It says your head matters. Your appearance matters. Your personhood matters. Even if the plantation thinks otherwise, cloth and adornment can also hold memory in small ways. Beads, shells, strings, ribbons, scraps of brighter fabric, or a particular knot in a head wrap may signal taste, heritage, or private significance. Colonial authorities often dismissed these details as decoration. They were more than that. Style could communicate dignity where dignity was denied, and belonging where belonging was threatened. A woman tying her headcloth with deliberate grace may be doing far more than covering her hair. She may be composing herself against a world determined to discompose her. Religious memory survives in fragments, adaptations, and mixtures. Some people hold to Christian teachings received on the plantation or through colonial churches. Others carry older cosmologies, ritual habits, protective practices, or conceptions of spirit that do not fit neatly into English categories. Many likely blend elements in ways that no planter or minister could fully recognize. A whispered prayer before sleep, a charm tucked into cloth, a gesture over a child's forehead. The use of certain herbs not only for healing, but for protection. Colonial records often misread or ignore such things, especially when they are practiced quietly. A curious tidbit from the period is that some white observers became deeply uneasy about objects they did not understand, especially charms, bundles, or marks made by enslaved Africans. What they labelled superstition often reflected a world of meaning beyond their grasp. Fear has a way of confessing its own ignorance. The planter who laughs at a charm by daylight may still think twice about it after dark. Language is another field of struggle. On early plantations, people from different African societies are forced together with English speakers, sometimes with speakers of Dutch, French, Spanish, indigenous languages, or Creole forms depending on region. Communication has to be built quickly for survival. That process produces new speech patterns, new vocabularies, new rhythms of expression. Words travel, shift, and settle. Some African terms remain in use within communities or in altered form. Others disappear from colonial hearing but continue in private. What emerges is not simple loss and not simple preservation. It is creation under pressure. You begin to realize that memory on a plantation is rarely grand and complete. It often survives in shards, a melody with missing verses, a recipe changed by available ingredients, a child named after someone long gone, a burial custom adjusted to local rules, a gesture repeated without a full explanation because explanation itself has thinned over time, yet shards still cut. They still shine. A broken inheritance is still an inheritance. Family feeling can extend beyond blood in deeply practical ways. Women nurse each other's children. Older boys watch younger ones on the path to the fields. A man repairs a stool for a neighbour's cabin because he knows that cabin holds people who once shared food with him. Someone carries news from one yard to another. Someone teaches a girl how to patch a garment well enough to last. These actions form a social fabric stronger than the plantation intends. Community here is made from repeated care, not ideal conditions. Grief lives close by as well. Families lose people to illness, punishment, overwork, sale, and the ordinary hazards of an undernourished life. The most feared rupture is sale, because it tears the living thread while pretending the person still exists somewhere else. A mother may not know where a child has gone. A husband may not know whether his wife on another plantation will be allowed to visit again. A brother may hear only rumour. This uncertainty creates a peculiar kind of mourning. You grieve someone not because they are certainly dead, but because the system has made them unreachable. That pain leaves marks on how people love. Affection can grow fierce and protective. Parents may hold children a little longer at night. Lovers may speak with urgency even in ordinary moments. Elders may teach quickly because they know time is never secure. The plantation creates instability, and instability sharpens attachment. Love under threat often becomes very precise. A hand on a shoulder, a bowl set aside, a word remembered and passed on. Small gestures carry enormous weight. There is also resistance in remembering itself. To retain family stories, ancestral hints, or cultural practices is to deny the owner total victory. Not loud resistance, not dramatic, but real. Every time someone says, "This child belongs to us in the ways that matter," the plantation's logic is challenged. Every time an elder tells where the family line bends and joins, something precious survives. Mainstream history now recognizes that enslaved people formed durable kin networks despite constant threat. But older scholarship sometimes understated the complexity of those bonds. That older view often relied too heavily on records produced by enslavers, men who were rarely attentive to the emotional architecture around them unless it affected labour. The actual life of the quarters was denser, more subtle, and more inventive than plantation documents admitted. The family was not merely damaged by slavery, it was also continually rebuilt within it. You notice, too, the role of memory and work skills. A man may farm with methods partly learned in Africa, partly adapted to new conditions. A woman may combine old plant knowledge with local practice. A cook may shape a meal around remembered tastes, even when ingredients are different. Memory is not only sentimental, it is practical intelligence. It travels in the hands. At times, memory grows uncertain even for those carrying it. A person may remember a grandmother's song, but not every word. A man may know his birthplace by river and season rather than by the names colonists would write. A child born on the plantation may inherit stories already thinned by rupture. That uncertainty can ache, yet uncertainty does not erase meaning. It merely makes memory feel more tender, more precious, and sometimes more painful. In the quiet of the cabin, you see people make an identity from what remains available. A family name half hidden, a story retold, a child comforted with an old phrase, a head wrap folded just so, a prayer that carries two worlds inside it, a joke that only certain ears fully understand. This is not nostalgia. It is daily work, as real as hoeing or hauling, and in some ways more necessary. The plantation can compel labour, separate relatives, rename the living, and scatter the dead. It can keep ledgers. It can issue orders. What it cannot do perfectly is govern memory. That work remains in human mouths, hands, habits, and affections. As you listen to the quiet murmur of people settling for the night, you understand that identity here is not a fixed treasure kept untouched from harm. It is a fire banked carefully under ash, protected from wind, fed with scraps, and carried forward because letting it die would mean losing more than the plantation has any right to take. Morning, noon, and night all carry the same quiet pressure on an early plantation. Even when no one is shouting, you can feel the rules moving through the place like an unseen current. A person learns very quickly that danger does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it sits in a look, sometimes in a pause, sometimes in the way conversation stops when boots approach on packed earth. On a plantation in 1730, fear is rarely theatrical. It is practical, steady, and woven into the air. You notice first the eyes. Someone is usually watching. An overseer surveys the field from horseback. A planter stands with hands clasped behind his back, pretending to inspect crops while actually inspecting people. A white family member peers from the house yard. A hired man lingers near a barn door. On larger estates, supervision may pass through several layers. On smaller places, the owner may watch more directly, which is not comforting. Intimacy with power can be more dangerous than distance because there are fewer places for tension to dissipate. The plantation depends on labour, but it also depends on obedience, or at least the appearance of obedience. That requires surveillance. Fields are arranged for visibility, paths funnel movement, work groups make slowness easier to detect. Even the timing of meals and rest can become part of the monitoring system. The whole place teaches you to feel observed before you actually see the observer. That kind of anticipation changes the body. Shoulders tighten, speech shortens, the face learns careful expressions. A person begins to perform safety. Overseers occupy a particularly ugly place in this order. They are hired to increase productivity and reduce what owners call disorder. In plain terms, they are paid to push, threaten, and punish. Some are brutal in obvious ways, others are coldly methodical, which may be worse. A raging man is at least legible. A calm man with a ledger can do immense harm while sounding almost reasonable. Plantation discipline often wears the clothes of management, as though violence becomes respectable once paired with arithmetic. The planter himself may present a softer face. He may speak of duty, stewardship, or Christian responsibility. He may pride himself on moderation. He may compare himself favourably to crueler neighbours, which is a neat trick when the scale begins with owning human beings. Yet his authority rests on the same foundation. He can order punishment. He can separate families. He can sell a person. He can withhold food, clothing, or access. Whether he frowns while doing so or smiles thinly over supper changes little for those below. Colonial law strengthens this atmosphere. By 1730, in places like Virginia and South Carolina, slave codes define black people as inheritable property and restrict movement, assembly, weapon possession, legal testimony, and self-defense. The law does not merely reflect plantation life, it arms it. If an enslaved person resists, runs, strikes back, or even appears too independent, the wider colony is prepared to support the owner's claim to control. Courts, sheriffs, patrols, a militia system stand behind the plantation fence whether they are visible on any given day or not. This legal world enters ordinary life in small humiliations. Permission may be needed to leave the property. A pass may be required for travel. Meetings after dark can trigger suspicion. A group standing together too long may be interpreted as plotting. A person carrying a stick of the wrong sort, a knife in the wrong place, or a look judged insolent can suddenly become a problem in the eyes of authority. The standard is never fairness. The standard is whether power feels challenged. You hear a phrase spoken sharply in the yard and watch how quickly bodies respond. Heads turn, hands still. Silence falls with startling speed. That reaction is learned over years. Children absorb it early. They learn the tones that signal danger before they fully understand the words. A raised voice from the porch, the hard crack of a name called in anger, the specific rhythm of someone marching fast across the yard. Sound itself becomes a warning system. Punishment hangs over this world as both reality and rumour. People know what can happen. A whipping, extra labour, restraint, confinement, being denied food, being sent to harsher work, being sold away. The full range depends on colony, owner, and circumstance, but the threat is broad enough that even uncertainty becomes useful to those in charge. Historians still argue over how often various punishments were imposed on specific plantations, because owners underreported some forms of violence, exaggerated their own discipline in other cases, and left enslaved voices largely out of the written record. Yet no serious scholar doubts the central point. Coercion was fundamental, not incidental. The fear of sale deserves its own shadow in the room. For many enslaved people, it is one of the deepest terrors because it can fall without warning and tear through every other bond at once. Sale is punishment, profit-taking, debt management, and social control rolled together. A person who talks back may be threatened with it. A family that depends on one another may live under it for years. You can imagine the silence that follows any rumour of a trader coming down the road. White patrols and local militias form another outer ring of pressure, especially after dark or in regions where lawmakers fear rebellion. These groups watch roads, inspect passes, and police black movement beyond individual plantations. Their presence reminds everyone that surveillance is not only local, It extends across the colony. A person attempting to visit a spouse on another estate, attend a gathering, or move quietly through the countryside risks interception by men empowered to question, beat, detain, or return them. Night offers cover, yes, but not peace. A troubling little detail from colonial records is how often lawmakers describe these systems as necessary for public order, as though order simply appeared out of nowhere and had to be defended from the people most injured by it. The language is revealing. It turns oppression into administration. It makes organised fear sound like civic hygiene. Bureaucracy has a remarkable gift for laundering cruelty. Inside the plantation, discipline can also pass through enslaved intermediaries. Drivers are often placed in painful positions, expected to keep gangs moving, and report problems while remaining vulnerable themselves. Their role could offer small practical protections in some circumstances, harsher pressure in others, and moral strain almost always. The plantation likes divided loyalties because they reduce the need for constant white presence. Power enjoys forcing impossible choices and then pretending those choices reveal character rather than coercion. You begin to feel how rules shape posture itself. An enslaved person may lower eyes in one setting and meet another's glance directly in a private one. Speech becomes measured. The body learns when to step aside, when to wait, when to answer quickly, when to appear untroubled, and when to hide distress. This is not natural submission, it is trained caution. People perform deference because the price of misreading a situation can be severe. Women face particular vulnerability under this regime. Their labour is watched, their speech judged, their bodies exposed to punishment and sexual coercion under a system that offers little formal protection. Colonial law protects ownership far more readily than personhood. A woman may have to navigate the moods of mistresses, masters, overseers, and male workers all at once. That constant calculation is exhausting in ways plantation records almost never count. The archive measures pounds of tobacco better than dread. Children live inside the same watchfulness. Though they experience it through dependence, they are observed for obedience, useful habits, and signs of spirit that adults in power may want broken early. A child too curious, too lively, or too quick with a reply may draw unpleasant notice. Yet children also become experts at reading emotional weather. They know which paths are safe today, which adult can be approached. And when the yard feels tense before any open conflict appears, fear, in such places, becomes a form of education. Religion can be used as another instrument of control. Some planters or ministers encourage selective Christian teaching that emphasizes obedience, humility, and earthly suffering while ignoring liberation, justice, or equality. Sermons, if enslaved people hear them, may be shaped to support the plantation order. Not every religious figure agreed with slavery in the same way, but many accommodated it, softened it with pious language, or treated the souls of enslaved people as real, while their freedom remained somehow negotiable. Human contradiction can be astonishingly convenient when profit sits nearby. At the same time, not all power on the plantation is formal. Reputation matters. A known hot-tempered overseer can control a field partly by memory. A mistress with a sharp tongue can make domestic spaces feel perilous even without physical punishment. An owner prone to suspicion can poison the mood of an entire week. People carry these reputations in their minds and plan behaviour accordingly. Social life becomes a map of temperaments as much as a map of buildings. One mainstream fact of plantation history is that slave codes expanded after earlier unrest, and as plantation economies grew, especially in colonies deeply invested in export agriculture, owners and lawmakers feared resistance because they knew perfectly well that the system rested on force, not consent. Fear ran upward as well as downward. That is worth noticing. The powerful watched so intensely because they were uneasy. They had reason to be. That unease appears in strange forms. Some owners restricted drums or gatherings. worried that communication might travel in ways they could not understand. Some became suspicious of nighttime singing, whispered conversations, or meetings around burials. What seems to them like menace is often simply community, grief, or ordinary human exchange. Yet fear in the minds of enslavers tends to broaden definitions until almost anything can look dangerous. A lantern seen at the wrong hour, several people walking together, laughter during work, silence during work. You begin to understand that under such a system, innocence does not guarantee safety. Scholars still debate exactly how consistent enforcement was from plantation to plantation. Some owners were erratic rather than systematic. Some regions depended more heavily on patrol networks than others. Some estates had more direct supervision because of size, crop, or labour force composition, but variation should not be mistaken for leniency. Irregular power can be especially frightening. If punishment depends on mood as much as rule, then every day carries uncertainty. The senses keep registering this world of pressure. You hear keys at a belt, spurs against wood, dogs barking when strangers arrive, the rustle of an overseer moving through tall crops where you cannot immediately see him. You smell horse sweat, leather, stale tobacco, damp wool, and the dust lifted by quick steps in the yard. You feel the peculiar chill that runs through the skin when a calm conversation ends because someone with authority is drawn near. Fear is not abstract. It is physical and immediate. Yet even under watch, people carve out zones of partial ease, a look shared at the well, a sentence finished quietly once the overseer passes, a prayer murmured where no one else can hear. The existence of these small spaces shows how incomplete total control always is. Surveillance may be constant in ambition, but it is never perfect in practice. Human beings still find margins, however narrow. As the evening settles in, the plantation seems softer from a distance. Smoke rises from cabins, the road darkens, crickets begin their steady song. But softness is deceptive. The rules remain in force after sunset. Passes may still be demanded, meetings may still be broken up, patrols may still move, a family may still lower its voices when feet pass outside. Night does not erase authority. It merely makes authority harder to see and sometimes harder to predict. By the time you lie down, you understand that one of slavery's harshest instruments is not only punishment itself, but anticipation of punishment. The mind rehearses danger long before danger arrives. The body stays ready when it wants to rest. The heart learns caution as a daily habit. This is how the plantation enters a person, not only through labour and hunger, but through the constant demand to monitor oneself under watching eyes and harsh rules. Even so, within that pressure, people keep some inward part alert for one another rather than only for threat. That, too, is a form of strength. You begin to understand very quickly that plantation life rests heavily on the labour of black women, even when the men who keep the records barely admit it. Their work is everywhere, in the fields, in the yards, over the fire, beside the washpot, at the bedside of the sick, with a child balanced on one hip and another task already waiting in the other hand. On an early plantation in 1730, black women are asked to do the impossible so often that the impossible starts to look routine. At first light, a woman may already be awake before the rest of the cabin fully stirs. She coaxes embers back into flame, checks what little food remains, lifts a sleeping child gently aside, ties cloth around her head, and gathers herself for a day that will demand strength before breakfast has even been imagined. The sounds around her are small but urgent. A pot lid touches clay. Wood shifts in the hearth. A baby gives a short cry. Someone coughs into the darkness. Even dawn feels busy around her. Then comes the field, because plantation labour does not spare women simply because another list of duties waits elsewhere. In tobacco regions, women plant, hoe, weed, worm, cut, carry, and sought alongside men. In rice country, they move through wet fields under a heavy sky, working in conditions that punish the skin and lungs alike. Their backs bend to the same rows, their hands close around the same rough tools, their feet grow sore in the same mud. The colonial habit of speaking as if women naturally belong to domestic corners falls apart the moment you look at the ground they actually worked. The body pays for this in layers. A woman may spend hours bent over a crop, straighten only long enough to lift something heavy, and then walk back at dusk to another shift of labour that nobody counts as labour, because it happens near a hearth. Sweat salts her clothing. Dust settles in the folds. The sun works on her neck and forearms until the skin feels warm long after shade arrives. By night her shoulders ache, her knees complain, and her hands pulse with that quiet, deep soreness that comes after a full day of gripping, lifting, wringing, or stirring. Pregnancy does not reliably excuse anyone from these demands. That is one of the bleak facts of plantation life. Enslaved women often continue working deep into pregnancy because the crop calendar does not pause for the body's obvious needs. They walk the fields carrying children not yet born while worrying over the children already at home. Historians know from plantation records, sale documents, and later testimony that pregnant women were routinely expected to labour, though practices varied somewhat by owner and region. Variation offers little comfort when the standard itself is so harsh. Childbirth brings another burden. Giving birth under slavery means facing danger with limited protection, modest shelter, and uncertain recovery time. Other women in the quarters often become the true support system, bringing water, cloth, herbs, steady hands, and the kind of knowledge that does not live in official books. A midwife may be deeply respected within the enslaved community, not only for practical skill but for calm. She knows how to read breathing, bleeding, pain, and silence. She knows when to whisper encouragement and when to tell someone to push through fear because there is no other road. The smells around birth are intimate and unforgettable. Warm water, smoke, sweat, iron-rich blood, damp cloth, herbs bruised between fingers, and the sour, sweet smell of a room crowded with anxious breath. The cabin may feel too hot, too close, too full of waiting. Outside, plantation life goes on with insulting normality. Chickens scratch, someone hauls wood, a man calls to a horse. Inside, a whole future balances on one woman's body, and after the child is born, the labour does not become gentler. It merely multiplies. An enslaved mother may be expected back at work quickly, sometimes while still healing. She feeds a baby when she can, soothes it between tasks, relies on older children or other women for help, and carries a constant fear that illness, punishment, sale, or hunger could take the child away. The law turns children born to enslaved women into inherited property, a cruel, legal arrangement that made maternity itself profitable for owners. It is difficult to overstate how monstrous that is. A mother's tenderness becomes someone else's ledger entry. That reality shapes the emotional world of women in ways the archive only partly reveals. Love must live beside dread. Joy at a child's first laugh may stand next to fear for that child's entire life. A mother watches for fever, for hunger, for the temper of white adults, for the approach of traders, for every small sign that safety might break. She carries not only her own exhaustion, but a permanent inventory of possible harm. Women also shoulder much of the daily domestic labour that keeps the quarters functioning. They cook, mend, wash, carry water, gather fuel, tend the sick, clean what can be cleaned, and improvise order inside cramped rooms. Laundry alone can consume astonishing effort. Clothes must be soaked, scrubbed, wrung, beaten, rinsed, hauled, and dried. The wash water turns grey and cold. Wet cloth drags heavily against the arms. Lye bites the skin if strong soap is used. Fingers wrinkle and crack. A line of garments shifting in the breeze might look peaceful from far off. Up close, it is fatigue pinned out to dry. Cooking demands its own skill, from poor rations and whatever can be grown, gathered, trapped, or traded. Women often make meals that stretch farther than reason suggests. Cornmeal becomes many things. Beans become a stew thin enough for several mouths. Greens are seasoned with a scrap of fat and patience. Fish is cleaned with quick hands. A pot is watched so it does not waste heat or food. This is not the sentimental domesticity later generations like to imagine. It is culinary triage, performed after a full day's work. A small but telling detail from the period appears in scattered accounts. Some planters admired the practical abilities of enslaved women when it increased output, yet still dismissed them as idle, disorderly, or naturally suited for servitude. The contradiction is almost absurd. A woman could hold together food, cloth, children, and work discipline for an entire household, and a white observer might still call her lazy if she paused too long at a doorway. Oppression does love an ungrateful review. Women's labour often extends into healing as well. They know which child needs willow bark tea, which wound wants cleaning with boiled water, which herb might settle the stomach, and which fever feels dangerous enough to keep watch through the night. Knowledge moves between women by observation, teaching, memory, and urgent need. African healing traditions, local plants, and colonial remedies blend in practical ways. A woman who knows how to reduce a fever or ease a difficult recovery becomes quietly invaluable. There is also the hidden labour of emotional steadiness. Someone has to calm the frightened child, console the grieving sister, encourage the exhausted husband, and keep a little order inside lives built to splinter. Women often do this while carrying their own grief unspoken. They absorb worry because the household needs someone to remain composed. That composure is not passivity. It is work, heavy work. Enslaved women face additional dangers that men do not face in the same way. Sexual coercion and exploitation are embedded in the structure of slavery, even when records avoid direct language or hide behind euphemism. A woman may have little legal protection against the desires of an owner, overseer, or white man connected to the plantation. The threat itself alters daily life. Where can she stand? When is it safe to be alone? Which errand might turn risky after dusk? Historians still debate the exact scale and reporting of these abuses in specific regions, because evidence is uneven and often filtered through hostile sources. But the broader reality is beyond question. The system left women dangerously exposed. You can feel that exposure in ordinary interactions. A summons to the house may carry a different weight for a woman than for a man. Service indoors can mean closer surveillance, but also closer proximity to the unchecked power of white family members. A mistress may resent, punish, or humiliate the enslaved women around her, even while depending on them intimately for childcare, laundry, cooking, and bodily service. Plantation households often ask for impossible loyalty from women they never treat as safe or equal. Yet strength takes many forms in these conditions. Some women become skilled negotiators of mood and timing, knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, when to ask for something, and when to wait. Some become anchors in the quarters. Women others seek out for advice, medicine, prayer, or sheer steadiness. Some protect children not biologically their own. Some keep songs alive. Some hide useful objects. Some laugh with a dryness sharp enough to puncture self-importance in a single sentence. Strength does not always look dramatic. Often it looks like endurance with intelligence. Women shape culture in ways that are easy to miss if you only read plantation records. They teach children language and rhythm. They pass on recipes, remedies, stories, gestures, hair practices, and moral lessons. They create small beauty from poor materials, a head wrap tied neatly, a baby soothed with a tune, a patched garment made almost graceful, a clay floor swept clean. These are not trivial flourishes. They're acts of world-making inside a world designed for extraction. Mainstream history now places much greater emphasis on the centrality of black women's labour to plantation economies. Though earlier scholarship often treated their contributions as secondary, that older habit was badly misleading. Women were not support staff in the margins of plantation life. They were foundational workers in both production and reproduction, in both economy and community. The plantation leaned on them constantly while refusing them the dignity that should have come with such importance. Children often experience women as the first line of order, safety, and memory. A woman teaches a little girl how to carry a smaller bucket without spilling. She shows a boy how to keep a spoon clean, how to step quietly when someone is ill, how to mind a younger child. She teaches by words and by example, because there is rarely time for formal instruction. A child learns competence from watching her hands. Those hands are always busy, stirring, folding, braiding, lifting, steadying, sewing, washing, touching, pointing, pressing. The hands tell the story as much as the voice does. There are even brief moments of softness that survive within all this labour. A woman laughing while rinsing clothes with another at the water source. Someone humming as she braids a child's hair. A shared joke over a pot that threatens to boil over. The smell of fresh herbs crushed into a simple meal. Warmth from a baby sleeping against the chest. Such moments are fragile, but they are real. They matter because they show that life is not reduced to toil, even when toil crowds every hour. As darkness settles and the cabin grows quieter, you see black women still moving through the dim light, finishing what the day left undone. One banks the fire, another checks a child's breathing, another folds a garment for mourning, another rubs tired calves with an oil or grease if any can be spared. Her own body asks for rest, but other needs keep arriving. The astonishing thing is not merely that she continues, it is that she continues with care. On a plantation in 1730, black women are asked to carry field work, household labour, maternity, memory, healing, danger, and emotional responsibility at the same time. The system depends on this without ever admitting the full cost. Yet in the quarters, in the fields, and by the firelight, you can see the truth clearly. Their labour holds lives together. Their knowledge keeps people alive. Their tenderness protects what brutality cannot fully reach. Their strength is not some simple heroic pose. It is daily, skilled, tired, alert, and profoundly human. When the hardest work of the day loosens its grip and darkness settles over the plantation, another life begins to stir. It is quieter, less visible, and far more fragile, but it is there. In 1730, black people on early plantations do not simply endure hunger, labour, and surveillance. They also create pockets of sound, feeling, and shared spirit that keep despair from becoming the only language available. At night, when the air cools and the sky goes deep, you begin to sense how much human life can fit into even the narrowest permitted space. The first thing you notice is the shift in sound. Daytime noise is full of tools, commands, wheels, animals, and strain. Night carries softer things. A low voice near a doorway, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, a child half laughing before being hushed, crickets pulsing in the grass, fire settling into red coals. Somewhere, almost too faint to catch at first, someone starts to hum. The melody is not performed for an audience. It is offered to the dark itself, to the people within it, and perhaps to the singer's own tired heart. Music on a plantation does not always arrive as a formal event. Often it begins in the body before it reaches the air, a foot tapping on hard earth, fingers drumming lightly against a knee, a hand patting rhythm into a child's back while easing it towards sleep, a woman stirring a pot in a slow repeated pattern that becomes almost musical. The plantation may try to regulate gatherings and suspiciously watch drums or loud group expression, but rhythm is harder to police when it lives in ordinary motion. You sit close enough to hear a voice rise more fully now. It is warm, worn, and steady. Others join, not all at once, but in careful layers. A line is sung. Another voice answers. The pattern feels communal even when no one would dare make it too obvious. This kind of call and response has deep roots in African musical traditions and becomes one of the ways black communities on plantations hold feeling together. Sound can move where written records do not. It can carry grief, prayer, teasing, longing, warning, and stubborn joy all at once. The songs themselves may be simple on the surface, a repeated phrase, a line about weather, work, sorrow, God, home, or sleep. Yet simplicity can hide great depth. A familiar phrase can mean one thing to white listeners and another to black listeners who understand the tone, timing, or shared experience beneath it. Historians still argue over exactly how much specific musical structure from different African regions remained intact in early 18th century British colonies, because evidence is fragmentary, and outside observers were poor listeners at the best of times. But no serious doubt remains that African musical habits, especially in rhythm, repetition, group participation, and vocal texture, shaped plantation soundscapes profoundly. Some music is for sorrow. People mourn the dead, the sold, the absent, and the unreachable. The voice at night can stretch grief in a way ordinary speech cannot. A note held a little longer than expected, a breath that trembles before the next line, a hush after the final phrase. These moments do not need explanation. Everyone nearby understands that the song is carrying something heavy. The plantation keeps trying to force feeling inward, but music lets it move safely through the group. Some music, though, is lighter. There are songs meant to amuse children, poke fun at vanity, or laugh quietly at the absurdity of powerful people who believe themselves grand. Gentle mockery survives remarkably well in hard conditions. A man with too much swagger, a mistress with a dramatic temper, an overseer who rides as if he invented horses. The jokes may stay indirect, softened into rhythm and playful wording, but the wit is sharp enough to be satisfying. Humour becomes an evening ration of its own. A small but striking detail from later recollections and scattered earlier observations is that laughter on plantations could flourish in moments outsiders would never predict. Not because suffering was slight, but because people sought relief wherever it could be found. A joke traded over a washpot, a comic exaggeration during a story, a child's imitation of a strutting adult. Human beings are terribly good at making room for amusement, even in places built for pain. It is one of our better habits. Storytelling often gathers beside the music. An elder settles onto a stool or low step, and the children move closer, though not always quietly enough to satisfy tired adults. Firelight flickers over faces, smoke drifts upward, carrying the smell of wood, fat, and earth. The story may involve animals, clever tricksters, boastful fools, or people whose mistakes are just recognizable enough to cause a few knowing smiles around the edge of the circle. Tales of wit defeating strength carry obvious appeal in a world where brute power dominates the daylight hours. These stories do more than entertain. They teach timing, caution, cleverness, endurance, and moral balance. A greedy figure gets embarrassed, a proud figure gets outwitted, a patient figure survives, a reckless figure learns too late. The lessons are not delivered like sermons. They arrive wrapped in humour, suspense, and memorable images. That makes them easier to remember and safer to share. A story can hold advice that no one could say plainly in the yard at noon. Prayer enters the night differently. Sometimes it is public within a small group, sometimes deeply private. A woman bows her head near the hearth and whispers words no one else is meant to hear. A man kneels outside in the cool dark where the stars seem too calm for such a troubled world. A mother crosses a child's forehead with a protective gesture before sleep. Religious life among black people on early plantations is varied and evolving. Some pray in Christian forms learned through colonial influence. Others hold older African understandings of spirit, ancestors, protection, sacred power, or ritual practice. Many likely blend these worlds in ways impossible to neatly classify. The atmosphere of such moments feels very different from daytime obedience performed for white approval. This is not a plantation sermon about submission. This is intimate, chosen, and often quiet enough to avoid attention. A spoken blessing over food, a plea for a sick child, a murmur for strength tomorrow, a gratitude for surviving today. Prayer, in this setting, is not abstract theology. It is a survival craft for the mind and soul. Sometimes the spiritual life of the quarters includes protective objects or acts that colonial observers misunderstand or fear. A bundle tucked into bedding, certain herbs placed near a doorway, a charm sewn into cloth, ash or marks used with intention. White people who notice such practices may dismiss them as superstition, though they often become oddly nervous about them as well. Fear makes a poor scholar. What it cannot interpret, it calls foolish, then worries about anyway. You begin to feel how much tenderness lives in these nighttime hours. A woman combs and braids another's hair with patient fingers. The touch is slow, rhythmic, and almost meditative. A father bounces a baby on his knee and hums until the child surrenders to sleep. Someone rubs aching shoulders with grease or oil if any is available. Someone shares the last mouthful from a bowl. None of this is grand enough for history books, which is exactly why it matters so much. The plantation records production. The people preserve life. Dance may appear in very small forms, especially where open gathering is risky. A quick step in the yard, a shift of hips and shoulders matched to a hand rhythm. Children imitating adults with comic seriousness. In communities with a little more room or fewer immediate eyes, dancing can become more open, with circles, clapping, and body percussion shaping the night. Movement offers release after labour, but it also restores pleasure to the body, which slavery constantly tries to recast as mere equipment. To move for joy, even briefly, is to reclaim something essential. Food can carry joy too, even when scarce, a better seasoned pot than usual. Fish caught from the creek, greens from a garden patch, corn cakes browned just right at the edge, a roasted sweet potato split open while still steaming. The smell fills the cabin with comfort that feels almost luxurious because it has been made rather than issued. Communal eating deepens that feeling. When people share what little extra they have, a meal becomes more than fuel. It becomes proof of relationship. Scholars continue to debate how often enslaved people on early plantations were able to gather in larger groups for nighttime social or spiritual activity, because practices varied widely by crop, region, season, and owner. Some plantations allowed more movement between quarters or neighbouring estates. Others restricted it sharply. Records often note gatherings only when whites felt threatened by them, which skews the picture badly. But the existence of these nighttime cultural worlds is beyond dispute. Wherever people had even a little cover, they used it. The senses keep building the mood around you. The night air cools, the sweat dried into your clothing. Smoke from several cabins hangs low and sweet. Frogs sound from wet ground farther off. Firelight glows through cracks in walls like tiny amber eyes. The dirt beneath your feet is cooler now, softer where evening damp has settled. Above, the stars stretch with the kind of indifference that can feel either cruel or comforting, depending on your mood. Tonight they feel like witnesses. Children absorb all of this. They learn songs before they understand their full meanings. They fall asleep to stories, prayers, and low murmured conversation. They watch how adults create moments of beauty from almost nothing. A gourd turned into an instrument. A lullaby made from an old phrase and a steady rhythm. A joke that rescues the room from sadness for a minute. Culture lives because children are close enough to hear it breathing. Night also allows courtship and affection to surface a little more openly. A young man lingers near a doorway longer than necessary. A woman pretends not to notice until she notices very clearly. A teasing exchange passes between them in low tones. In a world where ownership threatens every attachment, ordinary flirtation acquires a kind of bravery. To desire companionship, to laugh softly with someone, to enjoy the nearness of another body under the stars, these are not trivial pleasures. They are declarations that life remains larger than labour. There are limits. Of course, fear never fully leaves. Voices stay lower when footsteps pass. A gathering may thin quickly if patrols are expected or the owner is restless. A song may stop in mid-phrase. A prayer may become silence. Joy under slavery is often cautious, but cautious is not the same as absent. That distinction matters. So much of plantation life depends on denying black interior life. Yet here in the dark, it blooms in forms too subtle to inventory. One mainstream historical truth is that enslaved communities created rich cultural and spiritual lives under conditions specifically designed to crush them. Another truth sits beside it. These lives were not merely consolation prizes or decorative extras. They were sources of endurance, identity, and mutual care. Music structured feeling. Storytelling carried memory. Prayer offered protection and hope. Laughter relieved pressure. Touch restored the body. Shared evenings made survival less solitary. A final voice rises before sleep fully claims the quarters. It is softer now, almost a lullaby, and the melody moves through the room like warm water. A child's breathing slows. Someone near the door stops fidgeting. Even the adults seem to lean into the sound. Not because it solves anything, but because it eases the edges for a few minutes. That is often enough. You realize then that joy on a plantation is not the opposite of suffering. It grows inside suffering, around it, between its cracks. It is hidden, improvised, and fiercely protected. It lives in rhythm tapped by tired hands, in stories told under smoke-dark rafters, in prayer whispered over sleeping children, and in the dry little laugh that escapes when a person still finds the world ridiculous in all the right places. Night does not free anyone, but it gives people a chance to sound like themselves again, and sometimes that is what keeps the soul from going quiet. Not every act of resistance arrives with shouting, fire, or a dramatic chase through the woods. On an early plantation in 1730, the most common defiance is often quiet enough to pass as fatigue, clumsiness, misunderstanding, or bad luck. That is part of its genius. Open rebellion is dangerous and rare, and punished with terrifying force. Small resistance, however, can slip through the cracks of a system that believes it sees everything. You begin to notice it once you learn to look beyond the owner's version of events. The plantation wants labour to move smoothly, predictably, and without opinion, but human beings are not tidy machinery. A hoe handle loosens at a useful moment. A task takes longer than it might have taken. A horse is not brought around quite as quickly as expected. A row is worked with enough care to avoid punishment, but not enough enthusiasm to enrich the master unnecessarily. None of this overturns slavery. Still, it matters. It reminds you that the system can command work, but not perfect willingness. Slowness becomes one of the most common tools of resistance because it can wear the face of exhaustion. And exhaustion, of course, is always believable on a plantation. A man straightens his back for a little too long after bending. A woman carries a load with deliberate caution rather than speed. Someone pauses to fix a cloth that might not have needed fixing just then. Time stretches by inches. Those inches add up. Owners complain in letters about laziness and indolence, using words that reveal more than they intend. What they call laziness is often refusal in a safer costume. Breakage is another language. Tools wear out in honest ways, certainly, but not all wear is innocent. A blade dulls more quickly than expected. A rope frays. A cask does not get sealed quite right. A fence repair holds, but not beautifully. Damage must stay subtle, because crude sabotage invites harsh retaliation. The art lies in making trouble look accidental. A planter may curse misfortune while never fully proving where intention began. There is a quiet satisfaction in that. You see this most clearly in work that depends on care. Tobacco leaves can be bruised, rice processing can be slowed, livestock can become inconveniently unruly if gates are not perfectly timed. Kitchen labour allows salt to go a little astray, heat to rise too high, or a task to become less efficient than a mistress would like. Domestic service, in particular, creates space for tiny acts that masters and mistresses often read as incompetence rather than dissent. Their arrogance helps hide the truth. A curious detail from plantation life is how often enslavers insisted that black workers were childlike, careless, or naturally disorderly, while simultaneously depending on them for highly skilled labour that required timing, judgment, and memory. The contradiction is glaring. It also gave enslaved people cover. If an owner expects brilliance only when profit appears and foolishness whenever something goes wrong, then purposeful mistakes can hide inside the owner's own prejudice. Bias makes a convenient blindfold. Resistance also lives in movement. A person finds ways to visit a spouse on another plantation despite rules meant to restrict travel. A child carries a message that sounds harmless if overheard. Someone learns which path through the trees avoids the main road. Someone else knows how to reach the riverbank without leaving an obvious trace. These are not grand escapes yet, but they are small claims on space. The plantation says you may go nowhere. Feet quietly argue otherwise. Meetings after dark carry their own risk and importance. A few people gather near the edge of the quarters, in a yard shadowed by a fence, by a woodpile, or beyond the last visible cabin light. Voices stay low, topics vary. News from neighbouring plantations. Word of a trader on the road. Who has been punished? Who may need help? Which overseer is growing suspicious? Shared information is itself a form of resistance because isolation is one of slavery's favourite tools. People survive better when they know more than the master thinks they know. Sometimes what gets shared is practical help. A woman teaches another how to hide a small store of food. A man explains which patrol route seems less active on certain nights. Someone passes along herbal knowledge for treating a wound that cannot be openly discussed. Someone else watches children so a couple can meet in secret. Resistance is not always against the plantation in a dramatic sense. Often it is for one another. That difference is important. Care can be defiance. Food theft, if the owner would call it theft, lives in that same grey zone. A little extra corn, fish taken from waters the planter considers his, fruit gathered from a tree on land the owner claims, a chicken egg pocketed quickly. Under slavery, the meaning of property becomes morally distorted. A system that steals labour and life then complains when hungry people reclaim a fragment of sustenance. The records act scandalised. The stomach remains unimpressed. There are also moments of direct verbal resistance, though these are dangerous. A muttered insult out of earshot. A joke aimed so carefully it passes as innocence. A tone of voice that carries more edge than the speaker could ever admit. Wit becomes a blade sharpened on caution. A person may not say no plainly, but they may say something almost as satisfying in the right company. Humour lets anger breathe without always exposing it fully. Children learn some of these habits early. They observe which adults speak carefully, which ones can be trusted, and how messages move through a community without ever being announced. A child may seem to be wandering, singing, or playing while actually carrying news in plain sight. Because white adults often underestimate children, children can become effective participants in the hidden life of the quarters. Underestimation is another blindfold power gives itself. Running away remains one of the most serious forms of resistance. Though it is often temporary rather than permanent, a person may flee for a few days to avoid punishment, seek a relative, or force negotiation. Others try for longer escapes, heading into swamps, woods, towns or frontier regions where surveillance thins. Success varies enormously. Geography matters. So do patrols, local allies, knowledge of terrain, season, and sheer luck. Historians still argue over how frequently temporary absences versus long-term escapes occurred on particular plantations, because owners had mixed motives in recording them. Some exaggerated to display firmness, others hid unrest to protect their reputations. What remains undeniable is that flight haunted the imagination of enslavers because it exposed the obvious truth. People did not consent to their condition. The landscape itself can help resistance. Woods offer cover, rivers offer routes, marshes repel pursuers who prefer comfort. Night loosens sightlines. Weather can blur tracks. A hard rain is almost a co-conspirator. Even so, escape is costly. Hunger, dogs, patrols, unfamiliar terrain, and betrayal all threaten success. A person who runs carries hope and terror in equal measure. The choice is never casual. Not all resistance involves leaving. Sometimes it involves staying and refusing inward surrender, maintaining family ties despite prohibition, preserving stories and songs, practicing prayer in private terms, teaching children dignity when the world teaches them degradation. These acts may sound gentle beside sabotage or flight, but the plantation understands their danger. That is why owners monitor gatherings, distrust independent religion, and fear any loyalty stronger than loyalty to the estate. Culture itself can resist domination by preserving meanings the master cannot command. You notice how illness sometimes enters this hidden world too. Feigning sickness can win a pause from labour, though it requires careful performance because overseers grow suspicious. Yet even real illness can carry choices. How much strength to display, when to speak, whether to reveal a remedy that might lead to more demands later. The body becomes a site of negotiation. However unfair the terms, women's resistance often takes forms that the records miss or misread. A mother hides food for a child. A woman delays an errand to create time for someone else. A domestic worker overhears information in the main house and passes it quietly to the quarters. A midwife or healer protects privacy around births, illnesses, or relationships. Another woman pretends not to notice a rule being bent because solidarity matters more. These are acts of intelligence under pressure. They rarely look heroic in writing. They are heroic in practice. Men, too, must choose constantly between caution and assertion. One man may take pride in openly testing limits. Another may survive by appearing compliant while resisting more effectively under cover. There is no single correct method. Enslaved communities themselves could disagree about risk. A bold action by one person might endanger many others. A cautious person might be judged prudent by some, and too yielding by others. Resistance is rarely pure. It is full of difficult calculations. A mainstream truth of slavery scholarship is that resistance existed on every level, from daily non-compliance to organized revolt. Yet daily resistance deserves special attention because it shaped ordinary life constantly. Plantations were not stable machines occasionally disrupted by rebellion. They were unstable systems requiring endless effort to enforce because the people inside them resisted in ways large and small all the time. This is one reason owners complained so much. They were not merely greedy. They were perpetually frustrated. Owners responded with more rules, more watching, harsher punishment, and more suspicious interpretation of everyday behavior. That response reveals something important. Power was not confident. It was brittle. If a world built on dominance must worry over a broken tool, a whispered meeting, a missing egg, or a slow row of tobacco, then its strength is less complete than it pretends. Force can coerce bodies. It cannot create trust. Night deepens around the quarters, and the air cools at last. A few figures move quietly between cabins, too practiced to make much sound. Somewhere a door opens and closes, somewhere a baby wakes and is soothed, somewhere a man returns from a visit that was not exactly permitted. None of this will appear in the planter's neat account book tomorrow, yet it is part of the real life of the plantation, perhaps the most important part. The hidden exchanges, quiet refusals, and careful acts of mutual aid are what keep the people from becoming exactly what the system wants. There is a scholarly uncertainty that lingers over much of this world, because written evidence comes so heavily from owners, overseers, courts, and later observers. Historians often have to read resistance indirectly. A complaint about laziness may hint at a slowdown. A note about disorder may conceal a meeting. A missing labourer may have been fleeing terror, visiting kin, or both. The archive is full of people in power misunderstanding what they see. That makes reconstruction difficult. It also means the real extent of everyday defiance was likely broader than the records comfortably admit. You feel that truth in the smallest details. A look exchanged over a bowl. A deliberate pause before answering. A tool set down with more force than necessary. A path worn faintly through grass where no official path should be. Resistance leaves traces, not always explanations. The plantation tries to erase intention. Human beings keep marking the world anyway. By the time sleep draws near, you understand that survival here is never passive. Even endurance contains decisions. Whom to trust, what to hide, when to slow down, when to speak, when to risk a visit, a joke, a theft, a lie, a meeting, a prayer, or a run into the dark. These choices do not always look dramatic from the outside, but they accumulate. They make a counter-life beneath the visible one. On an early plantation in 1730, resistance often lives in small motions because small motions can travel farther than open revolt. A bent rule, a hidden message, a spoiled task, a stolen moment, a protected child, a whispered plan. None of these alone can break the plantation. Together, they prove something vital. The people forced to live under slavery were never simply acted upon. They acted too with caution, skill, nerve, and an eye for opportunity that kept the system from ever becoming as total as its masters wished. Night settles fully now, and with it comes a different kind of thinking. The work is done for the moment. The tools are still. The voices in the quarters have softened into low murmurs, sleepy breathing, and the occasional creak of wood shifting in the dark. You lie down on rough bedding and feel the whole plantation continue around you. Even in stillness, a horse stamps in a distant stall, somewhere near the edge of the yard. A dog gives one uncertain bark and then decides against further effort. Smoke hangs faintly in the air. The ground beneath you is hard, the blanket rough, the room close. Yet the mind keeps moving. This is what night can do on a plantation in 1730. It leaves the body exhausted, but the thoughts unusually alert. When the labour stops, other truths become louder. You think about what kind of world could make all this seem ordinary. A world where fields, cabins, laws, churches, rivers, ships, and counting books all join together to insist that one group of people may command another forever. The scale of it is almost absurd. One petty man with a ledger can ruin a family. One law written in a colony can shape generations not yet born. One crop grown in heat and hunger can travel across an ocean and return as wealth, while the hands that raised it remain empty. You feel the colony itself pressing around the plantation, though most of it is hidden by darkness. Courthouses and docks, warehouses and counting rooms, taverns where white men complain about prices and weather, churches where moral language drapes itself politely over brutal facts, roads where wagons carry crops and gossip in equal measure. Early plantations do not stand apart from society. They are society, or at least a central engine of it. Slavery is not an unfortunate side detail in 1730. It is structure, it is economy, it is habit made profitable. That truth can be difficult to sit with because it strips away comforting illusions. It is easier to imagine a few unusually cruel individuals than an entire order arranged around coercion. Yet the plantation works only because many people participate. Merchants insure ships, clerks record sales, neighbours return runaways, ministers preach obedience, craftsmen mend the tools of extraction, wives manage households that depend on enslaved labour while speaking the language of virtue. Even those who dislike overt brutality often accept the larger arrangement because it serves their interests or feels too familiar to question. Familiarity can be one of evil's favourite disguises. You understand now that for black Americans in 1730, the future is not an abstract horizon. It is a pressure inside the present. Children sleeping in the next cabin are already being shaped by laws they did not choose. Girls are born into inherited vulnerability. Boys grow under the eye of labour expectations from their earliest days. A child's first steps happen in a world that has already decided too much about those feet. The cruelty of hereditary slavery lies not only in what it does to adults, but in how it reaches forward with cold confidence, and yet people keep imagining futures anyway. That may be the most astonishing thing of all. A mother saves a little food because she expects her child to wake hungry tomorrow, which is a practical act but also a tiny wager on continuation. A father teaches a boy how to mend a handle well because skill might help him survive. An elder tells a story to children who will carry it in altered form. A woman plants greens by the cabin because she intends to be here long enough for them to grow. Hope, in such places, often looks modest. It does not arrive as banners and speeches. It arrives as planting, teaching, mending, naming, and praying. You listen to the night and notice how much of plantation life escapes the neat categories owners prefer. To the planter, people are labour units sorted by age, sex, and value. To one another, they are mothers, singers, healers, jokers, stubborn cousins, babies with strong lungs, old people with sharp memories, and young men who walk too proudly when romance is near. A ledger cannot hold that richness well. It tries. It fails. That failure matters. It reminds you that slavery could dominate bodies and time, but it never described human beings accurate. A strange little detail appears in some colonial correspondence. Planters sometimes complained that enslaved people seemed cheerful or sociable in moments when they themselves would have expected despair. The complaint is revealing. It shows how badly they misunderstood what they were seeing. Laughter did not mean contentment with bondage. It meant life refusing to shrink on command. Music did not prove childish simplicity. It proved community. Affection did not show dependency on masters. It showed loyalty elsewhere. The powerful are often poor interpreters of the people they exploit. The plantation's future also includes fear. White colonists know they are outnumbered in some regions or vulnerable in others. They know the system rests on force. That knowledge creates a constant undercurrent of anxiety among enslavers, even when they act relaxed over supper. Laws become stricter, patrols become more alert, gatherings become suspect. The very intensity of surveillance reveals insecurity. Masters watch because they do not trust. They do not trust because they know domination is not the same as consent. Fear runs both ways, though it lands very differently. Scholars still debate how deeply 18th century enslaved communities could imagine freedom in collective political terms, especially in regions where daily survival consumed so much energy and communication across plantations was risky. The archive offers only flashes, yet flashes are enough to show that people knew bondage was wrong. New alternatives existed, and recognised injustice even when they lacked safe ways to confront it openly. A person does not need a manifesto to understand that ownership is an insult to the soul. You think too about the Atlantic world beyond the plantation. Ships continue crossing the ocean. More captives continue arriving in some places. Prices rise and fall. Empires compete. Markets shift. Wars elsewhere alter labour demands here. The plantation may feel local when you're standing in a field with dirt under your nails. but it is tied to a vast commercial network that reaches from African coasts to Caribbean islands to British counting houses. That network feeds on distance. Distance helps buyers pretend they did not hear the crying at the point of capture, on the march, in the hold, on the block, in the cabin, or at the field edge. Profit often depends on not listening too closely. Still, the life in front of you remains intimate. The child turning in sleep beside a tired mother, the couple whispering in the dark, the old man whose hands shake now but once built half the fences on the estate, the girl learning songs while pretending not to listen. Social history lives here, in the texture of ordinary existence. Who eats last? Who braids hair? Who checks on the sick? Who remembers a proverb? Who shares news? Who dares a joke? Grand structures matter, but they press most heavily through small daily facts. The history of slavery is made not only in laws and trade routes, but in cabins, cooking pots, and the exhausted decision to get up again before dawn. The night also sharpens one difficult truth. There is no single black experience of plantation life in 1730. Age matters, gender matters, region matters, crop matters, language, birthplace, health, family situation, owner temperament, and sheer chance all matter. A newly arrived African captive lives a different emotional world from a child born on the plantation. A domestic worker hears different things from a field hand. A skilled carpenter moves differently across the estate than an elderly woman tied to the cabin and yard. Historians rightly resist flattening these lives into one story, because slavery itself imposed too much flattening already. Yet diversity within oppression does not lessen oppression. It simply makes it more human and more precise. You sense that the colony's future will continue to grow from the arrangements fixed here. Wealth made from forced labour will build houses, endow families, influence politics, and shape ideas about race that harden over time. Children of planters will inherit not only land and labourers, but assumptions. Children in the quarters will inherit danger, memory, skill, and unresolved hope. By the middle of the century, plantations in some regions will expand further, and with that expansion the system will become even more central, more defended, and more difficult to ignore. The roots are already deep in 1730. They are drinking steadily from law, commerce, and custom. A mainstream historical truth is that slavery in the 18th century was not a dying leftover. It was growing, adapting, and embedding itself more fully into colonial life. That matters because it corrects the soothing fantasy that such systems fade naturally once their ugliness becomes obvious. Often they deepen first. Often they enrich too many people to be easily abandoned. Moral clarity does not automatically produce change. Pressure does. Struggle does. And struggle can take generations. There is an uncertainty, too, in how individual people on this plantation imagine their own long futures. Some may dream mostly of surviving the next season. Some may nurture private visions of escape. Some may believe children or grandchildren could somehow live differently. Others may avoid imagining much at all because hope, when repeatedly disappointed, can become painful to handle. Historians cannot fully recover these inward horizons. The records were not made to honour them. But silence in the record should never be mistaken for absence of thought. The air grows cooler as the night deepens. The blanket no longer feels only rough. It also feels warm in patches where the body has made a little heat of its own. A coal settles in the hearth, with a soft red wink. The smoke smell has thinned. Outside, insects maintain their patient chorus. The plantation seems quieter now, but the quiet is not empty. It is full of sleeping people, banked feelings, unfinished griefs, and modest hopes laid carefully beside one another until morning returns. You realize that one of the cruelest ambitions of slavery is to make people feel temporary in their own lives, as though they exist only to meet the day's demand and then disappear into darkness without residue. but residue is everywhere. In songs children remember, in gardens planted beside cabins, in names spoken softly at night, in stories shaped to fit listening ears, in mended clothes, in hidden herbs, in the posture of a mother protecting a child with her whole tired body. These are traces, but traces accumulate. They become inheritance. So now the plantation grows still around you, and the long day finally loosens its grip. The fields wait under moonlight, quiet for once, their rows silvered and calm, as if they have forgotten the hands that worked them. The cabins breathe softly in the dark. Firelight has faded to a few gentle embers. Somewhere nearby, someone turns in sleep, and the sound is small, ordinary, almost comforting. You let the night hold all these lives without trying to force them into neat conclusions. A mother resting at last, a child dreaming without knowing what tomorrow will ask, an elder carrying memories that no ledger could ever measure, a young couple whispering into the dark as if tenderness itself might make a shelter. The plantation remains harsh, unfair, and heavy with power, but within it human warmth still survives in quiet forms. The air is cooler now, the smoke has drifted upward, crickets continue their patient song, steady as breathing. Above the roofs and trees, the stars spread out with a soft distant glow, untouched by the rules below. You rest there for a moment, in that wide night, letting the sounds grow fainter and the details blur at the edges, and as sleep comes closer, you keep only the gentlest truths, that people may care inside cruelty, that memory survived in whispers, that even in a hard and watchful world, songs were still sung, children were still held, and hope, however small, was never fully extinguished. The ground is still beneath you now. The dark is deep and quiet. The night has taken the sharpness out of the day, so you let the sounds fade, let the fields soften into shadow, and let the whole old world drift slowly into silence.